than more sooner than later of how much we need what is even trying to be suppressed again today. They're putting it to the point that our history does not matter. We look and we see, God, how they have suppressed and taught us what they want to teach us. And even now, they're trying to control what is being taught and eliminating anything that is taught about us. And so we pray that we then do not depend totally on them, but come together and teach ourselves about ourselves. We pray now for Sister Willis that will share with us again tonight. Crown her with the wisdom, knowledge, and understanding to make plain that we need to know. And we'll give you praise in Christ's name. Amen.
Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone has had a blessed day. We're all here, so that's a good thing. And okay, all right. And as promised this evening, in the last class, I promised to focus tonight on enslaved rebellions, which is something that's not taught or mentioned very often in schools or anywhere. And the reason being is that, for the most part, we're taught, we've seen in movies, and I saw movies, and I always wonder why do they always show that the enslaved people were seemingly satisfied with their situation. They never fought, in movies now, they never fought back, they never talked back, they never did anything to help their situation. Well, that's not true. And one example I want to share is that, I'm from Louisville, Kentucky, okay? When, if you're familiar with the Kentucky Derby, everybody heard of the Kentucky Derby? I lived maybe about, walking distance from Churchill Downs, so I could hear races being called. And I went to the Kentucky Derby maybe 2 or 3 times, but every year before the Derby races run, they sing My Old Kentucky Home. Now let me read you the original lyrics, some of the original lyrics to My Old Kentucky Home, which is written by Stephen Foster. So the sun shines bright in my old Kentucky home. This 'tis summer, the darkies are gay. And that does not mean homosexual. The darkies are gay, meaning yeah. And then another lyric is, the young folks roll on the little cabin floor, all merry, all happy and bright. This is written by Stephen Foster. So I mean, to see and this is sung every now, to their credit, eventually they changed the lyrics because there was, an uprising, with the African Americans in Louisville and in Kentucky, really about the lyrics of this song because it's, it's offensive, and it's not true and it's just totally offensive. So what they did, they said, the sun shines bright in my old Kentucky home, 'tis summer and the people are gay. So they, they did make some changes, and they still sing it. I watched it on TV a couple of weeks ago. They still sing it every year before the Kentucky Derby. So I just wanted to share that the misinformation and how things are viewed through the eyes of the slave masters and white people, and how things are viewed between, the enslaved and us as African Americans. So huge disconnect there, huge disconnect. So tonight we're going to focus on the 5 most notable rebellions that happened in the United States. Now, there's the Haitian Rebellion, which was the only successful rebellion in history, slave rebellion in history. But these 5 notable rebellions happened in the United States, and, just saying that they were not successful, but people in the enslaved tried over and over again to gain their freedom and fight against slavery. So it's truly a misnomer that I want people to know that, and especially our children to know that we did fight back. We did try to fight back in several instances. And the first one we want to focus on is the Stono Rebellion. And the Stono Rebellion, and these are in chronological order, and I've included little blurbs, and then there's little, graphs of what probably took place, because of course there were no cell phone cameras back then, so we just have to assume that these pictures are correct. But the Stono Rebellion was the largest rebellion organized by enslaved people in colonial America. It happened in 1739, and in South Carolina, which is where it happened near the Stono River in South Carolina. There were a lot of people from the Kondo Kingdom, which is a region of Angola, that were congregated in South Carolina. So South Carolina became known as the Congolese center of the North America. So and also put a note that the actual details of this rebellion are a little murky because, once again, there was only one first-hand count recorded, and it was a white residents in the area that wrote the record. So we have to kind of, I want to put that out there, that some of this may not be as, I mean, some of it probably is accurate, but I'm sure there's more detail. There were details that were left out, as we know how things go. But it happened in 1739 near the Stono River in South Carolina, actually on September 9th. There were 20 enslaved African-American people who met near the Stono River, and they, had planned a rebellion for that day. However, before they started the rebellion, the group stopped at a firearms depot store, and where they executed the white owners and then placed their victims' heads on the storefront steps and then took the guns, okay? So, I mean, and what I'm gonna be talking about is pretty brutal tonight on both sides. There was a lot of beheading and a lot of, rebellion was brutal back in those days. So just be forewarned that, a lot of what we're gonna talk about is pretty brutal. So, and then they marched down to St. Paul Parish, and with signs that read Liberty, they had drums they were beating, and they were heading down to St. Augustine, Florida, which is where, some of the free Spanish Africans were living in St. Augustine, Florida. However, even though it's really unclear who was leading the group, it is thought that an enslaved person rather, named Jimmy, Jemmy, was the leader, or the main leader of the group. The group killed several of the enslavers, or the slave masters and their families, in burning homes as they traveled through the area. As they went through, headed down to St. Augustine, more and more enslaved joined the group. However, some of and you'll find this in every situation too, some of the enslaved avoided the group and helped to hide their masters, okay? So there's always a few that don't go along with the program, okay? I don't care what the situation is, it's always, don't go along with, they may have been happy and gay where they were, maybe they were well taken care of, and sometimes we get so comfortable in our shackles that we don't realize that we're in shackles, So they were a little bit comfortable there. So they helped to hide their masters. However, they were able to fight off the group with Jimmy and his group were able to fight off the English for more than a week. But after a little while, the white militia found the group, which was about 10 miles from where they were originally, and then the enslaved men were decapitated in front of other enslaved people. So that's a big deterrent to have that happen. And in the end, there were 21 white people and 44 black people that were killed in this rebellion. Many of the rebels, including Jimmy, remained at large for about 3 years. So he was not one of the ones that was decapitated. And as did the spirit of insurrection, and as you'll see throughout this lesson, even though it was challenging, it was hard, it was, brutal, when you're really in a situation where you feel like there's no other way out, you're going to do whatever's necessary, like Malcolm X says, by any means necessary to get out of your situation of being oppressed. Some of us will, not everybody, but some of us will do whatever's necessary. And I think we're in this situation today. So yeah, you have a question? Oh.
Yes, but I was told I have to have a microphone.
Yes, please, if you ask a question, please wait for the mic.
Okay, my question ties into your history here, which I think is important to also lift out. Now, You said this is a group from the Congo.
Yes,
So this is some of Nzinga's people.
ain't from Angola. Well, Angola, the kingdom.
Angola now, but Congo.
Well, it was the Kingdom of Congo was in Angola at that time. Yeah,
Okay.
so yeah, it could have been some of Queen Nzinga's people from the Congo that were captured, brought to the United States and brought to South Carolina and stayed in South Carolina.
Then it's important that I know you can do this to kind of tie it together. Why was Nzinga? And you know, I believe this. Nzinga was one of the baddest women ever to live. Warrior king, the real warrior king, and they fought. And this is the first one, from what you're saying, it's the first revolt. And you remember, she was the most successful. We got a terrible mic here.
Yeah.
She was the only successful African slave leader who got whites out of her country.
Right.
In the Congo.
Yeah.
They stopped. They could not get any Africans out of the Congo after
So I've got to look up timelines, but most likely Queen Nzinga happened after this, after the 1739 revolt. Yeah, because she stopped it after that. So I want to look up the timeline. I'm sorry, I can't keep all those dates in my head. I want to make sure I have the right dates all the time. So I'll look it up. But yeah, Queen Nzinga was able to thwart, white, with the Portuguese white slave captures and prevent them from taking any more people out of the Congo, out of Angola at a certain point. Any other questions or comments right now? Okay, so like I was saying, many of the rebels, including Jimmy, remained at large for up to about 3 years. Then he was able to stay on the run for 3 years, and like I said, as did the spirit of the insurrection. However, in 1740, the city of Charleston's authorities arrested about 150 enslaved, and in order to squash the spirit of rebellion, they hanged 10 people daily, okay, in order to, just to make people intimidated, or make the enslaved intimidated to not try to do any more insurrections. So, but this reflected the tensions of a slave society where, the enslaved were constantly, from what my readings and understanding, they were constantly trying to think of ways, not only as individuals to escape, but as a group. They tried to together, but as fate would have it, there's always somebody or some other minority in the group that's trying to, go against the group and really, cause the group to, the insurrection to fail. So that's the first one. Now the second one, any questions or comments about the Stono Rebellion? Okay. The second one is called the New York City Conspiracy of 1741. And this insurrection is also known as the Negro Plot Trial of 1741. Now, even though historians are really unclear about how or why this rebellion happened, it did happen in New York City. And at that time, New York City was was the leading individual port for slave trade in the colonies before 1700. And this, I'm talking about, this was in downtown, what is now downtown Manhattan and Wall Street. That was a big, huge slave trading area. Where the Wall Street was built on the backs of slaves. The financial district was built on the backs of enslaved people in New York City. Now, some historians believe that the Black people had developed a plan to end enslavement, and others have argued that it was believed that it was part of a larger protest to against the colony, being a colony from England in New York City. Either way, it was between March and April of 1741, 10 fires were set throughout New York City, which is then called New Amsterdam. If you go back in your history, world history, or U.S. history classes, it was called New Amsterdam before it was called New York City. And on the last day of the insurrection, 4 fires were set. However, a jury found that a group of Black arsonists had started the fires as part of a conspiracy to end enslavement and to kill white people. They said that was their goal. Over 100 enslaved African Americans were arrested for burglary, arson, and insurrection. And of those, 13 African American men were burned at the stake, 17 Black men, 2 white men, and 2 white women were hung, And then, in addition, 70 African-American people and 7 white people were expelled from New York City. So there's not a lot of other information about this insurrection, but, you know, it did happen in 1741 in New York City. So any questions about this? This is gonna be pretty fast because there's only 5 that we're going through, but also I'm gonna show a film on one of them. But these are, you know, just to give you an idea of what the enslaved thought about, planned, and very thoughtful, and potentially if they had I guess the agreement of the other enslaved people, could have maybe pulled it off in some ways, but, you know, they didn't have any guns or any weapons, so they had to steal them or make them, as we're going to talk about here in just a second with Gabriel Prosser. Okay, so let's go on. Yes. Now you got to have the mic.
You just reminded me that this was a revolt where whites obviously supported the blacks.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Was there any information on who some of those white people are? If they hung some and killed others and banished, I think it's important now, if we're going to stop and teach the truth in history, in a revolt like this, we have to also point out that there are those who obviously felt otherwise. Just like there are blacks who turned blacks in.
Right.
There were whites who stood up for blacks, and I think that's important to note. Yeah,
almost in every situation of the insurrection, there were some whites that were supportive of the insurrection. However, I did not, in my studies, I had not seen any names or anybody, you know, specifically called out, but there, you know, in every situation, there were some whites that were supportive of the insurrections of the enslaved people. All right, any other questions or comments or observations before we go on? Okay. So the third one I want to lift up is Gabriel Prosser's rebellion plot. And this is an interesting one to me because Gabriel Prosser was one of the few enslaved people whose owner allowed him to learn how to read and write. Also, he was a very talented blacksmith, so he was able to learn a trade. And they say he wore fine clothes, you know, around the plantation, so a lot of the other enslaved people looked up to him. However, Gabriel Prosser and his brother eventually planned a rebellion that was the most far-reaching rebellion in the United States history, which was inspired by the Haitian Revolution. The Prossers organized, enslaved, and freed African-American people, poor white people. So a lot of times, you know, the poor whites were the ones that were joining the insurrections too because they felt oppressed as well, you know. So the poor whites and Native Americans. And this revolution was really against wealthy white people at that time. Okay, but Gabriel's road to the revolution actually began as a fight over a stolen pig. You know, like some of one of the world wars was over one little tiny incident. I forget which one it was right now, but sometimes one little incident can kick off a huge rebellion or even a war. But apparently, Gabriel fought a white man and bit off his ear. Now, typically, if an enslaved person did something like that, he would have been executed. But because of the fact that Gabriel's master allowed him to learn how to read and write, become a blacksmith, he was one of his favorite, you know, enslaved persons. So he was given a little grace. He was not executed. However, he did receive a brand on his hand that meant that if he got caught doing anything like that again, he would definitely be put to death, okay? But as a result, Gabriel became very resentful over the situation. You know, he was feeling pretty good and had a lot of opportunities that other enslaved people did not have, and being treated like this in this situation, he became angry and resentful. So in 1799, Gabriel and his brother Solomon hatched a plan to take possession of Capitol Square in Richmond. And now he lived right outside of Richmond. This is Richmond, Virginia. He lived right outside of Richmond. So the plan was to take possession of Capitol Square in Richmond, and they wanted to hold the governor at that time, Governor James Monroe, as hostage, and bargain with authorities to find a way to end slavery. Then after telling Solomon and his brother Solomon, another enslaved man, Ben, of the plans, they began to recruit other men to their plot. However, in this situation, women were not included in the militia in this insurrection. And one we're going to talk about The next one, women were included, but this one they were not. The men were recruited throughout cities of Richmond, Petersburg, Norfolk, Albemarle, as well as the counties of Henrico, Caroline, and Louisa in Virginia. Presser, he was fortunate as a skilled blacksmith. He used his skills to create swords and then mold bullets. So he was able to create the ammunition and the weapons needed to fight off or to fight in this insurrection. The motto of the rebellion was the same as the Haitian Revolution. Once again, he was influenced by the Haitian Revolution, which was death or liberty. And although rumors of the upcoming rebellion did reach Governor Moore, he kind of just, laughed it off and thought, okay, no big deal, nothing to really worry about. However, those rumors were ignored. So Prosser planned the revolt for August 30th, 1800. Remember, he started planning in 1799. However, on that day, there was a very severe thunderstorm which washed out the roads, making it impossible to travel, so they could not do it that day. The following day, the rebellion was supposed to take place. However, several of the enslaved African Americans became afraid. If you don't do it right when you're supposed to do it, everybody kind of gets, intimidated and starts to retreat. They became afraid and started sharing plans with their enslavers or their masters. And then the landowners then set up patrols and alerted Governor Monroe in saying that these folks, these enslaved people are really going to do what the rumor said they were going to do. So, Monroe organized the state militia to search for the rebels. And then within 2 weeks, almost 30 enslaved African-American people were in jail waiting to be seen in these words, the Oyer, which is O-Y-E-R, and the Termini, T-E-R-M-I-N-I, which is a court back in Virginia at that time in which the people were tried without a jury but were permitted to provide testimony. So they did catch 30 of them and put them in jail waiting for their trial in these courts. The trial lasted about 2 months, and it's estimated about 65 enslaved men were tried. It was reported that 30 ended up being executed while the others were sold away. Some were found not guilty and others were pardoned. And now remember, they were able to provide testimony. So based on their testimonies, based on, I'm sure, their status on the plantation, some were given grace and some were not. So you know how that goes. It's not what you know, but who you know. However, on September 14th, Prosser was identified to the authorities, and this happened initially back on August 30th, August 31st. August 30th, it was washed out. So on September 14th, Prosser was found, identified to the authorities, and then on October 6th, his trial began. And several people testified against him, and I'm sure some of the enslaved as well, but Prosser refused to make a statement. And then on October 10th, he was hung in the town gallows. So this one was really interesting to me because of his status. You know, he did not have to do that, but you know, sometimes we have to get angry at a situation before we are incited or encouraged or, you know, motivated to do anything about it, you know. So any comments? Or yes, Sister Joan.
Okay. My mind is still back to, you were talking about the first one, I believe it was, and you said that they were trying to get to St. Augustine.
Right.
Where they were free Africans?
There were Spanish Africans, or Africans that were owned by the Spaniards that were in St. Augustine at that time. You know, so they were trying to get down to St. Augustine.
Say that again?
They were Spanish, okay, the Spanish at that time controlled St. Augustine, and there were some Africans that were owned by the Spaniards, but they were allowed, well, let's say, more like, I guess, indentured service at that time, so they were trying to get down to St. Augustine. But there were Spanish Africans. They were there at St. Augustine.
Oh, okay, I'm listening to you, and in my mind, I always thought that everybody was just enslaved, every black person, and only the ones up north were free.
No, no, no. And as we'll learn a little bit later, New Orleans had a large free a large amount of free blacks that were in the New Orleans and Louisiana area. As a matter of fact, some of the free blacks in the New Orleans and Louisiana area had owned plantations and owned their own slaves or enslaved people. You know, so there, you know, it wasn't just the whites that owned enslaved people. There were some Africans or African Americans that owned enslaved people as well and had plantations. So there were, you know, a large number of emancipated or free blacks, especially in the New Orleans area. Okay. Any other questions, comments? Before we go on, okay. So, and this one is coincidentally is happened in Louisiana. This next one is called the Andries Rebellion, which is also called the German Uprising of 1811. And in the reason now Germany has nothing to do with it, although it's called that. But Andries Rebellion was the largest revolt in United States history. Okay, even though it was not successful, and we're going to see a little film about it in just after I finish talking about it, but it was the largest revolt in United States history. So on January 8th, 1811, a mulatto enslaved man named Charles Deslons, and that's, I think I put it on, yeah, his name is on the sheet there, Charles Deslons, which was, they said was most likely a formerly enslaved Haitian. He was also a slave driver. Okay, so does anybody know what a slave driver did? When I say the term slave driver, do you know? Does anybody know what that term means? If someone was a slave driver? Does anybody have any idea what that was? Okay, yeah. You need the mic so everybody else can hear.
I believe they'd be called an overseer.
Exactly. They were overseas. Can you describe how they operated?
Well, I believe the overseer would make sure that the enslaved blacks will be kept in line, if you will, and they go against the grain, they would be punished by the overseer in lieu of the master.
Yes, exactly right. Typically, especially like on the cotton and sugar plantations, the overseer usually had a horse, was riding on a horse, or the slave, they called the slave driver, rode on a horse, rode around to make sure all the other enslaved people were doing what they were supposed to do. If they didn't, they had the right to, and they usually had a whip, so they had a right to, you know, whip the enslaved that weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing. So keep in mind that Charles Deslons was a slave driver, but he eventually became so sickened by the arrogance of the whites and his own role in having to enforce their will on the sugarcane fields of Louisiana that he led an organized rebellion of enslaved people and Maroons through what's called the German coast of the Mississippi River, which is about 30 miles from what is now present-day New Orleans. So as Deslon traveled, his militia grew. So he started out with maybe a small group, but as he went through, you know, down along the coast of the Mississippi River, more and more enslaved people joined him. Eventually, there was about 200 revolters, men and women, that joined